Let's get to the New Testament, because Luke 10:20, this is the first time Jesus himself mentions this book. And in Luke 10:20, Jesus begins the New Testament affirmation that anything to do with the book of life has to do with a confident, expectant assurance of salvation. This is what it says in Luke 10:20. They were coming back from their missionary journey, and they were so excited because they had seen great things happen, and demons were subject to them. And this is Jesus' admonition to them. Nevertheless, do not rejoice that the spirits are subject to you. You shouldn't get all enamored with temporary ministry, he said. But, look at this. Rather rejoice because your names are written in heaven. It doesn't say book of life. But now we're starting to get the idea that this written in heaven stuff has to do with confident assurance of being a citizen of heaven. Now, the next mention of this, look at Philippians 4, and then we're going to get to the book of Revelation, where it's mentioned 6 times in a row. But Philippians 4, and I underlined in your mind Philippians 4:3, that Paul said the New Testament saints could be assured of their place in the book of life. And if they could, we can too. Philippians 4:3, I urge you, true companion, help those women who labored with me in the gospel, with Clement also, and the rest of my fellow workers, look at this, whose names are in the book of life. The book of life. Now, this is the first full-blown explanation or description, or at least mention of this book of life. Moses said the book of the living. It doesn't say Lamb's book of life, and it's kind of vague. Psalm 69 says blot them out of the book of the living. Daniel 12 says that there's a book that God is going to, in Malachi 2, a book of remembrance of his people. He won't lose memory of them. Jesus said your names can be written in heaven, but it's not until Philippians 4:3 we realize how they get written there. They get written there in this book of life. Now, turn to Revelation 3:5. This is where we kind of put our plow in and we start getting into the great, great blessing of the book of life. It says this, he who overcomes, Revelation 3:5. Overcomers are not super Christians. They're not a separate class. They're not a higher level. They're not the, Martin Luther's and St. Augustine's of the world. They are born-again Christians. The book of 1 John defines an overcomer as someone who has been born again. And Revelation keeps that up. And so an overcomer is just another word. We are called, if you're saved this morning, you are a saint, you are converted, you are saved, you are born again, you are a son and daughter of God, or you're an overcomer. So there are many different descriptions of who is going to heaven. And so don't get hung up on the overcomer word. That, as we studied in Revelation several months ago, is another term for Christian. A Christian, an overcomer, shall be clothed in white garments, and I will not blot his name from the book of life. Christ said that we have the assurance that we will never be blotted from the book of life. Now that causes a lot of excitement, because that divides Christendom. There are 2 branches of Christendom. The Reformed, who believe in eternal security of the saints, and the Arminian, who believe you better watch out, you might get erased. Those are the 2 views. What is the book of life? Some view this book of life as a record of all the living. And when the unsaved die, their names get erased from it. That's interesting. I mean, that's held by great saints of God. Personally, I think that a better view is that the book of life is a record of those who are saved, whose names were written in the book of life from the creation of the world. Now, to understand that, keep turning in Revelation to Revelation 17:8. When we get to Revelation 17:8, we are looking at Satan unleashed. And he is coming and he is fighting against everything to do with God on this planet. And he is just raising hell, literally. He is bringing the demons to bear. He is just causing horror on this planet. And in the middle of all that, look what happens when the Lord's describing this period, the false worship and everything else. Revelation 17:8. The beast that you saw was and is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit, and will go to perdition. And those who dwell on the earth will marvel, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world. Now turn back to 13:8. The same thing is said. Revelation 13 and verse 8. and all who dwell on the earth will worship him, that's the Antichrist, the incarnation of Satan, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. Now what we see is, very clearly, every time it comes up in Revelation, no one can be erased from the book of life, because it was written before the foundation of the world, and it lists the inhabitants of heaven. And what they say is that the lost people's names were not written in the book of life. If you just, no matter how you look, which direction you look at, the book of life does not contain lost people's names. So there has to either be multiple books, a book of the registry of every human that's ever lived. Maybe it's a book of who God is raining on with blessing at various times. But the Lamb's book of life, as it says here in verse 8, it was written from the foundation of the world. Okay. Therefore, the book of life is the roll of the elect. It was written in eternity past by God from the foundation of the world. Now, what does that mean? Well, foundation of the world is a frequent phrase in the Bible. It occurs in Matthew 13, 25, Luke 11, John 17, Ephesians 1, Hebrews 4, 1 Peter 1. And it refers to God's plan before creation. That means God did this before he created the world. But, and this is what I like, regardless of which view you take, at the end, in Revelation 21:27, only saved people are in the book of life, and the book of life contains the inhabitants of heaven, whose names have been written there by God.